How did a small and sparsely populated colony located on the edge of the known world transform itself into the fifth largest nation on Earth? To find out, let's go back to the beginning and find out how America won its war of independence and became the United States. To really understand this period of history, we need to first understand the mindset of the time by breaking down one of the most iconic lines ever spoken in American history: "Give me liberty or give me death." This was a speech given by Patrick Henry at the Second Virginia Convention in 1765, and while it may be over the top to some today, it was actually quite a nuanced argument for the time. In order for people to be free, there must be a government to protect them from outside threats. But when the government becomes the threat, then resistance is justified, even if it means giving up your life. At the time, Britain and the other European powers were all monarchies, meaning that the head of state was a king who inherited his position and had complete control over the nation. In theory, the king was supposed to rule with the consent of the governed, but in practice it meant the king could do pretty much whatever he wanted. Now, not everyone liked this system, but for centuries there wasn't really any alternative. That was until the American Revolution. The original 13 colonies had been founded by Britain as a way to expand their empire across the Atlantic. Much like the Pilgrims before them, these early settlers were largely running away from religious persecution. As a result, they had a generally good relationship with the mother country until King George II came along. His solution was to have Parliament pass a series of laws that would bring the colonies under tighter British control and force them to help pay off Britain's massive debt. But the colonists weren't having it. So in 1765, they drew up the first of what would become a very long list of grievances against the crown. For the next 2 decades, the colonists would protest these new taxes through a variety of nonviolent means. But the more the crown tried to crack down, the more the colonists resisted, which led to the Boston Tea Party of 1773. King George was not pleased, and in response, he decided to punish Massachusetts. He shut down the port of Boston until the colonists paid back the 92,000 pounds of tea that had been destroyed. Now, the colonists could have just paid for the tea and called it a day. After all, it was only 92,000 pounds, right? But instead, they decided to fight back. They wrote a letter to other colonies telling them to do the same thing. Soon, every port from Maine to Georgia shut down until the king backed down. Now, this was a clever move, but it's important to understand why it worked. At the time, colonial merchants were heavily reliant on trade with Britain. But they also traded a lot with other parts of the empire as well. Shutting down the ports hurt the colonies economically, yes, but it also threatened the economies of other colonies as well. And if they didn't back down, the whole empire could collapse. The king saw this and panicked. He created the Intolerable Acts, which punished Massachusetts further while also attempting to assert his authority over the rest of the colonies. For example, he stationed 4,000 soldiers in the colonies to keep the peace. But this move only inflamed tensions further. These acts were so unpopular that the colonies held a Continental Congress in 1774 to discuss a unified response. All 13 colonies were represented at this meeting, which resulted in a year of boycotts and protests against British goods. By the following year, things had escalated enough that fighting broke out between the Redcoats and the colonial militias at Lexington and Concord. While technically not the first battles of the war, they are often considered the opening engagements because of how significant they turned out to be. These battles immediately went viral throughout the colonies, and soon every state was sending out militia to take up arms against the crown. By the time the war began, the Patriots had an advantage over the British, and it wasn't because they were better trained or better funded. It was because they knew the land and the people like the back of their hands. The British strategy was to ignore the militias and march to the nearest major city, where they expected to raise loyalist troops to put down the rebellion. But they quickly found out that wasn't going to be the case. Every step of the way, the Patriots ambushed supply lines and communication routes, forcing the British to constantly fight on the defensive. It was so bad that after the Battle of Long Island, British General William Howe reported that his men were, quote, "in want of everything," end quote. This is what made the war unwinnable for the British. No matter how hard they tried, they couldn't get enough supplies to win a decisive battle. But the colonists weren't winning any decisive battles either. They were winning hearts and minds. Between 1775 and 1783, the Patriots published hundreds of newspapers, pamphlets, and broadsides to rally support for the war effort. One of the most popular was Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which argued that the monarchy was an outdated concept and that the United States should declare itself a republic. Another was Richard Henry Lee's Resolution for Independence, which outlined all of the ways that the king had abused his power and violated the rights of the colonists. These documents electrified the public, and support for independence soared. Soon, entire counties and states were declaring themselves independent republics, and once that happened, it was only a matter of time before the Continental Congress followed suit. Now, this wasn't a unanimous decision by any stretch of the imagination. Many delegates opposed the idea of independence, believing that it would be too difficult to win. Others worried about what would replace the monarchy if the revolution succeeded. But no one can deny that Thomas Jefferson was the most influential voice for independence. His draft of the Declaration of Independence outlines the principles that would form the basis for the new nation. It begins with the famous line, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Then it goes on to argue that the purpose of government is to protect these rights, and when the government infringes upon them, then the people have a right to alter or abolish it. The document concludes by declaring the 13 colonies to be free and independent states. The signing of this document on July 4, 1776, is considered to be the birthday of the United States, and from there, the war for independence was on. The newly formed United States needed to convince other nations that the fledgling republic was worth supporting in its war effort. And the best way to do that was to win a few victories. Fortunately for the Americans, they had someone who was up for the task. George Washington had been a successful military commander in the French and Indian War, and he was the unanimous choice to lead the Continental Army. Under his leadership, the ragtag army of farmers and shopkeepers was able to hold off the British, which convinced France to enter the war on their side. With the additional manpower and supplies, the Patriots were able to wear down the British and win key battles at Saratoga and Yorktown. After 8 years of fighting, Britain was exhausted and ready to make a deal. The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, officially ending the war and recognizing the United States as an independent nation. Now, despite being victorious, the new nation was in a lot of debt. Winning the war had taken a lot of money, and now there was tension between the northern and southern states over how to pay it back. The northerners wanted to tax imports, while the southerners wanted to tax land. Eventually, they compromised and agreed to tax both, which raised enough money to retire most of the national debt. But the war had lasting impacts on the nation as well. Before the war, there had been a growing divide between the rich and poor. But during the war, the middle class had risen up and fought for the nation's independence. As a result, there was less of an appetite for lavish displays of wealth. Plus, the war had killed off thousands of landowners, which led to a period of economic uncertainty. The solution was to start a brand new financial system. In 1790, Congress established the first national bank and began minting its own coins. Then in 1792, the first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, proposed a plan to pay off all of the state debts. This proved to be incredibly controversial, but in the end, Congress agreed to the plan, setting the stage for the United States to become the fifth largest nation on Earth. The American Revolution was a watershed moment in world history. It demonstrated that a group of ordinary people could come together and build a better future for themselves. And it gave birth to a new form of government that has inspired generations of revolutionaries. Today, the United States is the oldest constitutional republic in the world and the fifth largest nation on Earth. But none of that would have been possible without the courage of those early settlers who dared to dream of a better world. If you enjoyed this episode, stay tuned for more.